Welcome to the Backyard Professor live videos. I am, of course, your host, the Backyard Professor. We're going to talk about Jesus tonight in a very interesting discussion that I have been very privileged to participate in, and why the historical Jesus matters to Mormonism. So let's get this road on the show. Okay, here we are. Let's get going here. This subject is truly one of the most intriguing subjects of all of history. Really, truly, because we live in the West, the Western part of the world, and we really take our Jesus seriously here. Whereas in the East, they are more in the Buddhist, Shinto, stuff like that. The Vedantic side of things, we have in some ways stupidly gone to the literal historical, and in other ways, the historical is absolutely invaluable. Based on what little I've read, I only have about 200 books on the historical Jesus behind me. A few more up there. Then I've got my Roman and Greek stuff up there. Based on what I've read, I can say unequivocally that Jesus in the religions, in the various churches, is an interpretation. And now this is what gives this thing its punch. It's what gives this subject the clout that it has, because Jesus in the New Testament is also an interpretation of those particular writers. And so how do we get behind the interpretation to the historical verity of this very interesting figure? The bad news is we don't. The good news is that with a comparison contrast of analyzing the various historical materials that we do have, if there are any, with different comparisons of other historical figures, we can at least get a tentative, that means a not final, but a tentative conclusion. The arguments that have been presented, it's already been a decade, which is just blowing my mind, since Richard Carrier wrote on the historical Jesus, that great big 700-page thick tome on the historical Jesus that just really took the world by storm. Some say in a teacup, some say in a tidal wave, on the historicity of Jesus, why we might have reason to doubt. I have received new word that Carrier is potentially working up a second text on this. He was thinking of just kind of revamping and updating this and including some of the reviews and all that. I'm not going to talk about Richard Carrier tonight directly as such. What I have going tonight is a much more interesting thing for you, the audience. We have had lots of discussions thanks to my dear friend Dastardly STEM on Shade's message board, and thanks to my other friend who is taking the opposite side, a gentleman who goes by the name of Kish Kuman. There are other excellent scholars in these threads on the historical Jesus. Did he live? Didn't he? Who was he? What did he do? What didn't he do? What should he have done? There's all kinds of speculation. Now, in this subject, we rightly so get into speculation as we analyze the evidence. There's no question about that. But understand the relevance of the historical Jesus studies to Mormonism is, I'm going to tell you that answer right up front, and then we will explore this fantastically interesting discussion. We'll begin to explore it. This discussion goes on for hundreds of pages. There are millions of articles, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of books on this. There's no way to exhaust it. There's all sides taken. Some say Jesus was an alien out of a UFO. I mean, there's just all kinds of bizarre theories. Loch Ness Monster is his sister, just all kinds of dingling dingbat stuff. I'm going to keep it more on the realistic level, I'm hoping, in sharing some of the information that these gentlemen are discussing. And so let me say hi to everybody. Tim Rathbone, welcome. Don Smith, Mark Crispin, yeah, baby. That's for Jesus. Yeah, baby. Hey, I could do a t-shirt like that. Yeah, baby, for Jesus. Wendy Rowland, good to see you. Hard work. Carva Amica, I broke my glasses, so I probably can't see it. Doug Vincent, my main man. Very good. Hey, Lee Mortensen, good job. JB Maybe One, nice to see you. Moksha Raver, always good to see you. Mosia, nice. Thank you for showing up. Appreciate it. Do believe I saw Dave ZB. Yes, Dave ZB and Corva Amico. Flat Pat. Hello, my friend, Flat Pat. Dan Vogel. Honored to have you in the audience as well. Newton Lemos. Good to see you, my main person. Okay, look, I've said hi to all of you. You're just repeating yourselves now. So, okay, let's get on with this shenanigans of this historical Jesus. Now, I'm not going to come to any hard, fast conclusions because there may not be any for quite a long time. But the principle I want to share with you tonight that I found so fun, so enjoyable, and so enervating. Hey, there's your new word for the night, enervating. Backyard Professor said enervating. What the heck does that word mean? Ask Siri, she'll tell you on your telephone. Yep, ask her right now, I'm telling you. Put it in there. I'm just saying. Enervating. In fact, I'm going to do that. Let's find out what this new word the Backyard Professor is talking about and see if it actually works. Why not? Someone's got to do this silly noise. I'm going to do it. All right, hold on. Siri, what does enervating mean?
Here's the definition of enervating. Causing one to feel drained of energy or vitality.
Oh, to feel drained of energy or vitality. Yeah, that can do that too. So energizing is probably a better word. Enervating, I'm trying to give you new words and they're the wrong definition, but on the other hand, this subject can drain you of vitality if the evidence you think supports your interpretation of Jesus doesn't actually do so. That can be a downer, and I have been there, believe me. My views on Jesus through the years have certainly switched, changed, gone different ways. I'm still up in the air about a lot of it. Mormonism's Jesus, bad news for you Mormons who think you're basing your view on reality. You're just like all the rest of us. You are basing your interpretations and views on an interpretation. Now, I'm not saying that as a bad thing, not at all. However, interpretation never has the final word, and new information continues to come forth. I would present the Dead Sea Scrolls, 1945, and right after that, the Nag Hammadi codices of the Gnostic material, which gave us an entirely weird new view of Jesus that Christianity had not seen for millennia, because they stamped out the Gnostics, who were a branch of the early Christians in the first place in Jesus's day, because they didn't believe like they did. There were different beliefs, and so the ones who were stronger stamped out, that's how baseless their testimony was. They couldn't use the truth to demonstrate their Jesus was real. They had to slaughter their enemies first. And then, of course, you have no choice. There's only one Jesus, ours. He just happens to be the right one. You see how that works? Very convenient for the winners, yes? So the Jesus in Mormonism is an interpretation. And so long as we can approach it in that thinking, then we will be safe in saying, yes, I am studying Jesus. You can believe in Jesus. I truly don't care. It's not offensive to me if you do. You can believe in Mormon Jesus. It's okay. It's not going to offend me. If your Mormon Jesus tells you to tell me to give you money, I'm going to tell you to go kiss off. That's not what your Mormon Jesus has the power to do for me anymore. If your Christian Jesus does that, I'm going to tell him to kiss off too. If Jesus wants the money, he'll come to me directly. That would be my approach to that issue, because it all boils down to money and power, right? That's how it is. So what is this discussion that I'm talking about this Jesus? I like what Doug Vincent is here saying, and I'm going to show his comment. Very good. I like the teachings of Jesus regardless of historicity. That's one of my points that remains utterly fascinating to me. It's what keeps me looking into the New Testament. I have had Trevin Hatch, the New Testament scholar, on here, the New Testament Jesus scholar, who insists that the organized religions, including his own, might have incorrect understandings of Jesus, and therefore he's been trying to correct them. I will have him on more often. I have also had the world classic biblical scholar James Tabor on here, who is talking about the historical Jesus through the Apostle Paul, things like that. I have had Richard Carrier himself on here with my good friend Derek Lambert of Myth Vision, and we talked a little bit about the historical Jesus somewhat and his work on that. So this discussion is what I want to do is I want to use this discussion as an exemplification of the kind of discussion that we ought to be having back and forth. Jesus, the title of this is Jesus, the Myth That Fools Us All. Now, in a way that can be offensive, but actually in a way that speaks the truth. It really does fool us all a lot. That's fascinating. He says, I've made the point several times that it does not matter if a Jesus who can be considered the one who preached and began Christianity ever lived. Now, and this is one approach. Now, it's real interesting that people get offended still when you say something like that. We're not trying to offend anybody. We're trying to explore the various views on Jesus. That is, to the believer or to the non-believer. The myth is found in the stories written about him. All writings about him did not originate with Jews who lived in Jerusalem. They were written by Hellenized Jews, adept at Greek, and educated in Greek and Roman legend. They were written with Greek and Roman legend in mind, accentuating Hellenized Jewish hopes, it appears. And I have had Dennis McDonald on my program a few times, and he is big on this with the utilization of the Greek classics from Homer, Euripides, Hesiod, the Aeneid, Virgil's the Aeneid, etc. It appears, as it were, there were no mortal voices helping the formation of Paul's teachings of Jesus, hinting to him what Jesus was. He gives ambiguous hints that there might have been a Jesus that preceded him, but not much more. And Paul is clear, he's preaching that which was revealed to him from above, kind of like the Mormons do today. And yet their Jesus is not the same Jesus as so many other Jesuses either. And this is my side snide. I'll call it my side snide. There's no real way to be graceful about this, and I apologize in advance. I can't. The message of the entire Western world, okay, is that it's really important to Jesus that we get to know him. It's important to know who Jesus is, what he did, where he was, etc. This appears to me at this stage in my journey of exploration of philosophy and religion and history and science and psychology and all of that. This appears to be more of a wishful human thinking. Just to put it out there. Jesus is very interested in you getting to know him. Well, his method doesn't work then. Now, and based on and I get it, yeah, I know, the later theological materials that Jesus has been saddled with in the centuries following when he lived, teach something that could not possibly have been in his own mind. And so that's why I say it could be wishful thinking, because really, truly, if it is important for me, say, to let you guys know what I think, then I can come onto YouTube and I can tell you what I think. If I want people to know me and to like me and to care for me and care about me, I can do that pretty easy these days. So why are there still so many blatant, wild, weird interpretations of Jesus if Jesus could also do it this way? It sincerely makes no sense. The theme, and I can't remember the scholar right off the top of my head, the secret Jesus, the messianic secret, Weed, W-E-D-E, I believe he was one of them. The idea of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, and I'm studying the Gospel of Mark course by James Tabor, very, very impressive course on exegesis of the Gospel of Mark and historicity and mythology and all that. Yeah. Well, if Jesus really was that needful, how else can I put this? If Jesus was really sincerely interested in us getting to know him, he just doesn't give me the appearance of doing it correctly. And this is so odd because he's supposed to be the creator of the entire universe. He's supposed to know it all. The later theological innovations are obviously just mankind's wishful thinking about what Jesus is thinking and wishing and wanting and hoping for and doing and what makes him mad and what makes him happy, etc. His lack of communication skills is simply staggering. when you really take a step back and look at the state of the world and see that it never has come to a unity of the faith, that the more that the more groups of Christians that split off from each other over an innovative interpretation of, say, the doctrine of baptism, or the doctrine of the Holy Ghost, or the doctrine of God. All these differences have led to wars, death, killing, hatred, suspicion, paranoia, defeatism, superiority, arrogance, condescension, rudeness, and yet none of us still know Jesus. That's kind of crazy, isn't it? I mean, when you really stop and analyze that, that is blitzoid lunatic. That's a new term you can quote me on. Backyard Professor says it's blitzoid lunatic. Yeah, because it is. How is it that we humans can communicate so very well our desires to each other, but the God of the universe can't communicate to the humans his desire, so that all humans know who this guy is, and so they want to make him happy, or they want to be happy with him, etc. This is assuming that the human mortal teaching that this is very important to Jesus is actually true. The evidence out there in the world would refute that proposition rather easily. And so, in making this discussion back and forth between the historical Jesus and the mythic Jesus, I like how the give and take occurs. I really enjoy, I'm going to make this a series, I do believe, because there's so much to it, and it's worth doing, because the back and forth and the way that we learn through comparing, well, that evidence doesn't look that strong, this evidence does, is really good. Let me give you a good example right here, right now. Similarly, there were no human voices ringing in Mark's ears conveying quotations from a master teacher. Mark was clear. The story he wrote ended without anyone being told the great secret. Now, this is true. This is actually true. James Tabor makes this clear in his presentation as well. And someone came along and did not like how the Gospel of Mark ended, and so they added some more information to the ending of Mark, trying to make it more theologically acceptable to a later generation's belief in Jesus that had evolved from and into a different sphere than what Mark himself believed. So one would have to presume too much to get from either of the first accounts about Jesus to even render a hope of historicity. So Dastardly Stem is arguing that these problems argue that Jesus Christ never existed. And that is one of the options that is on the table in this particular discussion. And there are people on both sides of this fence, which makes this so interesting. The later accounts are all dependent sources, so it remains pertinent to continue to address that pointless historical dogma that Jesus existed as I see it. And a century after Paul, that's 100 years after the Apostle Paul, Justin Martyr, one of the early Christian church fathers, contrary to what Christian apologists, and I would say Mormon apologists today, say, Justin Martyr made the point that the Christian religion is simply a recapitulation of many Roman and Greek legends, but they did this recapitulation of these old legends from a Jewish perspective. I say contrary in regards to apologists today because, of course, today's apologists wish to distance the Jesus story from all outside influence. Now, this very much is how the Mormon church that I was raised in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s was definitely taught about Joseph Smith as well. So this has a very relevant parallel I would propose to you, my audience. They want to distance Jesus' story from all outside influence as far as possible. The apologists need a history that never was. They need to presume uniqueness and hope that such rhetoric matters. Our apologists today need to pretend that the romanticized stories about Jerusalem and Jewish happenings were accounts. And most of these defenders erroneously say first-hand accounts of something that really took place. But Paul and the anonymous author of Mark crafted their works not by first-hand accounts from others, but as creative works, invented much like religion would have it, through imagined hopes of past heroes and gods, legends and myths. Our Jesus was made not out of a mere man who walked around preaching his odd form of Judaism. No one in history knew that man. He was made by creative thinkers living among diasporic Hellenized Jews, Greek and Roman thinkers alike. And in fact, and this quote is a very popular one for those of you who do study the early Christian fathers, this one will probably ring bells for you. This was a partial aspect of Justin Martyr's defense of Christianity. Now remember, Paul was what, 50, 60, 70? Justin Martyr is a century later, so we're talking I'll say 150 to 170 AD, just as a historic chronological reference for you. So here's Justin Martyr defending Christianity. He says, and when we say also that the Word, who is the first birth of God, was produced without sexual union, and that he, Jesus Christ, our teacher, was crucified and died and rose again and ascended into heaven, we propound nothing different from what you believe regarding those whom you esteem to be the sons of Jupiter. Now, that's actually a very interesting defense because the version of Christianity called Mormonism I was raised in would never have taken that approach, ever. No. You can't show similarities between Joseph Smith's first vision and other people in his day who had first visions. And I mean first visions, God the Father and his Son Jesus Christ visiting him. I mean that kind of first vision. Other people in Joseph Smith's day had that. We have Dan Vogel in the audience. I'm taking this information from his book, Seekers. So, and this is something I never knew until I got Dan Vogel's book when I was 25. I had never, ever. Joseph Smith's first vision was said to have been the only one ever in the history of the world. But Joseph Smith is the unique prophet that got it, and therefore, based on this unique occurrence, of course, he is able to propound unique, true doctrine of God and Jesus. This is the stuff I was raised on. The early Christians had the exact opposite stance with Jesus, and there are Mormons today who are still, they hate the idea when there are things called pagan, quote unquote, pagan parallels with Jesus. They can't stand that. They misapply the interpretive meaning of Jesus into something totally unique, or else he can't be who he claims he was. They did the same thing with Joseph Smith, right? Now we know the flaw of that methodology. Well, the early Christians did the exact opposite. They said, oh, no, no, no. Our teaching of our God is exactly like the teachings of your God. He was crucified, he died, he rose again, and he ascended to heaven. Now, this is an eyewitness, hang on. This is an early witness within 200 years of the Christian understanding that I would propose could be seen as pretty darn significant, in my opinion. And so there is that aspect of this historical Jesus. And Justin emphasized that the stories of the Christian's hero, crafted perhaps 100 years before him, were myths no different from those of the surrounding populations. Now, it's really interesting that we have such a fascinating, what would I call it, an anomaly right now today in Mormonism, because the idea that we are a peculiar people, Saturday's Warriors peculiar type people, is how I was raised. Many of you were too. And that we are different from Christianity because, of course, the great apostasy, Christianity fell away from the true teachings, and now only we are the unique, one true and living church on the face of the whole earth. I mean, that's the Mormon status I was raised to believe in and that I taught on my mission. That's why I went on a mission, right? And so this theme has been downplayed in the last, 20 years. Now, the Mormons are beginning to tell the Christians, oh, no, wait a minute. We're not any different from you. We too believe in grace. We too believe in Jesus in the New Testament. We too have the sacrament, etc. Now it seems the emphasis has shifted to where the Mormon Church is attempting to be just like Christianity. It's a fascinating flip-flop, isn't it? It's a very interesting situation to at least be cognizant of so that we understand what's going on. This idea of the Logos born without sexual union, crucified, died, rose again, ascended to heaven, these were all themes among the heroes and gods of Roman and Greek antiquity. Now, the sticking point here appears to me to be that if Jesus just did what other pagan gods did, then that somehow, how would you put it, nullifies his power, maybe? I mean, this is the impression that Christians and Mormons give us when you get on this topic and you say, well, the early Christians said Jesus was just more of the same type of deity as all the other religions and cultures. They didn't feel he had to be unique, so why are you? But this is still a sticking point, right? That for whatever reason, unique has come to mean authentic. But that wasn't the case in early Christianity. And so if Joseph Smith was restoring early Christianity, then why have they been so off base attempting to make everything within Mormonism totally unique? You see the problem. This is a very interesting conundrum, I would say. So the thing is, facts were not the game in the early Christian. Jesus was given the story of legend, not because the legends that preceded him prophesied of him, they were given so he could stand as a credible legend among many others. He was not given such a station because Mary and Joseph's son was a real guy, but in hopes to outdo and outmaneuver the other myths that inspired the people all around. To say Jesus lived was not the guy written about, as many tend to do, is just to say he never was. Now, this is Dastardly Stem's take, and he is adapting some of Richard Carrier's argument. I'm just showing you that there is this argument and there is this attempt to utilize some of the early Christian literature in order to make the argument. Now, what is so remarkable is Mormons do this all the time, Christians do this all the time, of course, is the early Christian church fathers and their information is also utilized by the religions to demonstrate that Jesus, in fact, did live and that, in fact, he was the Son of God. So, two different groups, it appears to me, can analyze and look at the same information, the same evidence, and have different interpretations. Now, when it gets stupid is when one of the religions tells the other religion, oh, well, you're being falsely misled by Satan and you're being inspired by the devil while we have the true doctrine. That gets nothing but warfare, hatred, and crap run amok, and that's just the wrong avenue. That's not at all what this particular discussion is doing in any manner. So that kind of gives us a break-in into this. I'm not going to be able to get through all of this. This particular thread has 39 pages, and I'm not going to be able to even read the beginning of the first 4 pages. I'm just trying to give you a brief introduction to it, and I will do deep dives into this as I can. It's very interesting that Dastardly Stem utilizes Dennis R. MacDonald's exquisite scholarship on the parallels between the Iliad and the Odyssey and Euripides with the Gospel of Mark. And he shows this, how the Greek classical materials definitely did influence, and I have done some videos on this. I have had Dennis MacDonald on. I will try to have him on again. That's true. It's very interesting. It's remarkably amazing of how Dennis MacDonald has brought all of this material together. This is not to say that because the Gospels utilized the Greek materials that they couldn't have utilized the ancient Jewish materials. It's not an either-or proposition. It's not an either-or situation. Look, Mark either used the Greek literature or he used the Old Testament. He couldn't have used both. Well, that's a flawed methodology from the get-go. The fact is, we now know that he, in point of very fact, could very well easily have used both. And there is a high probability that he did so. This doesn't threaten the message that Mark set out to explicate to his audiences. It does not mean that the Gospel of Mark is entirely false and invented just pure hokum either. It's remarkable how when we explore these evidences and we look at the various angles of these types of arguments and the literatures that very well could have been utilized, the astonishing thing comes out, especially through Dennis MacDonald's writings, that Jesus is elevated. Jesus begins to become enlarged. And I think that's one of the, for myself, that's one of the key takeaway points for reading Dennis MacDonald. I really like his approach. I also really do enjoy Thomas Brody's excellent approach, where he demonstrates with really good evidence that the gospel writers indeed took stories from the old Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, and utilize the forms, the plots, etc., in some of their stories to make illustrative religious and ethical points for their audiences. So there's a lot of complexity here. I'm not going to go into all the detail. I can go into some detail a little bit in this series, which I will do, but so let's keep looking. I wanted to get to, I'm going to skip and jump here on purpose because there are some really good ideas here that I really thought was worth. Okay, and this is one of them. Now, Gadianton asked, he said, I don't understand the claim. Starting with the Justin Martyr quote, let's say Jesus is a son of Jupiter, no more or no less. Are you saying that instead from Jesus to Christ, it's really from Christ to Jesus? Now, this is, Gadianton is always an astute logician philosopher. I love being on this message board for that reason too. See, the normal claim is some guy did some preaching and his followers made him larger than life until he was Christ. It sounds like you're saying start with Christ, a God, and then create a backstory that puts him as a local preacher. So that's very interesting. So STEM says, yes, it may take a review of the previous threads, but you are correct. The traditional idea is that there was some unknown and unreported guy who began Christianity. The take by different scholars of late is not necessarily MacDonald and Miller, whom I quoted in the opening paragraph, but others. That's more of a guess than a conclusion. So the idea traditionally is Jesus, the guy, may have lived, and the stories written about him were all myth. Not a bad thought. And of course, I have no issue when people propose it, except to say it doesn't seem to be a supportable conclusion. It seems more likely Jesus was simply a character treated by early Christians, much like all those who tend to fall into the same camp as he is. A son of God, a savior, a hero, a wise one, a magic healer, etc. There's lots of those in Jesus's day. So then perhaps if there is no real difference in saying some guy who lived but was not the character written about and was at some previous time walking around Jerusalem and its environment was the subject who began the myth, and the myth was first written down without any real person in mind. Again, this is Stem's argument. The point I'm making here is to suggest the writings about Jesus were all from Greek and Roman influenced Jews, and their writings demonstrate their heavy familiarity with and dependence on previous Greek and Roman influence and culture. So they couldn't help but make a story that runs in deep proximity to what a god and hero was to the people steeped in Greek and Roman tradition. So using similar themes, the same words and ideas, it surely could be these foreign guys wrote about a guy they heard about in Jerusalem, but that seems less and less likely when considering the cultural context from where and when this all came about. And so he's trying to discuss some implications. Now, at one point, Dastardly Stem said, there's no evidence for a Mary and Joseph as parents of a known Jesus person other than in tales written. There seems to be nothing more than myths about a magic god hero. Not sure that qualifies as solid evidence of these two having lived any more than parents of Hercules or Romulus or Asclepius having existed. And Honor Theos says, Eisenman in James, the brother of Jesus, laid out evidence that the ultimate dominant branch of Christianity worked to eradicate evidence of Jesus having a family. If Mary was not only a virgin when Jesus was born, but also remained one to rise to divine status herself, then evidence of her having a family was a problem. So they were largely, but not entirely successful in doing so. That process, that evidence would make little sense if Mary and Joseph were inventions themselves. And I think that's a really good point for Honor Theos. And then my good friend Huckleberry, who is a very prominent Christian philosopher among us, he said that Stem did not understand Justin Martyr's quote correctly and accurately. And so he's trying to quote some more Justin Martyr, his apology. He says, unfortunately, it's dual reading. I fell asleep several times in the process. Justin meanders and is slow to the point. So anyway, so they're having some back and forth. And then res ipsa says, Stem, how do the parallels you cite support the conclusion that the mythical divine Christ wholly invented, as opposed to being a mythologized real person? Why do you expect that there would not be parallels to other mythical figures if the myth of the divine Christ were based on a real guy named Jesus? And I thought that was a very interesting question. So you see, they're trying to explore, they're asking questions. Sometimes the questions aren't answered until pages later. So I'm not trying to confuse you. I'm just trying to share with you the back and forth and the ins and outs of how actual, really good and careful discussions, sometimes even really excellent scholarship, occurs between people who are interested in this topic. You can count me in on that. With the recognition, and this is probably my most important point tonight, the recognition that there is no finality of a correct interpretation of Jesus that is available to us at this time. Now, there's nothing saying later on there could be. He really may well be proven to be an entire invention in someone's mind. We just don't know. He may very well be able to be proved to be a real historical person. We just don't have enough one way or the other. So this is why we deal with the probability. Now, the religions love this for this reason, because now they can sneak in this concept of faith. But it's not faith in Jesus that they want you to have. It is faith in their interpretation of Jesus that they want you to have. That way, they can extract more money out of you. I'm sorry to be so blunt and crude, but it seems like that is the only reason religions give a flying flip about any of us. They really don't act like they care at all about your souls or about what Jesus thinks of you. Why would they? But they really love it when they can get your money. That's cynical, but that's real. So that's my approach. So now, Huckleberry, this Christian philosopher I was telling you about, when res ipsa asked Stem, how do the parallels you cite support the conclusion that the mythical divine Christ wholly invented as opposed to being a mythologized real person. He wants to add to this question. So here's Huckleberry's point. It could be that storytelling devices from the Hellenistic tradition. Now, the Hellenistic tradition is in Alexander the Great conquered the known world, I'm going to say roughly 300 BC, just to round it off, 328 BC or something like that. And then after he died, it split into 3 different sections all over the known ancient world. And the part that Jerusalem and Palestine was in was the Hellenized. It was controlled through, by, and with. It was most heavily influenced, I'll put it that way, by the Greek culture. So the Greek, the Hellenes, is the Hellenized Jews, meaning that the Greek culture became part and parcel of their everyday life. That is what Hellenization is. So the Hellenistic tradition is the mixing of the Greek with the Jewish. That's how I'll put it, to keep it simple. So it could be that the storytelling devices from Hellenistic tradition, imitation, shaped how the Gospels narrative were shaped and put together, but I do not see how that clarifies how real or imaginary the Jesus story is. A collection of sober facts could be shaped into the style in question. See, most of the Jesus story has little to do with the myths and a lot to do with Jewish beliefs, hopes, and politics of this time period. He makes a pretty good point. It could be realistic. You can find mythical style imagery in the birth narratives, perhaps a couple of other episodes. So, and Honor and Theo says, I'm curious how this theory addresses the appearance of the Gentile controversy between Paul and the Jerusalem Christians. Very interesting concept. So you can see everybody's kind of getting their own little ideas going together. And what we're going to do is we're going to discuss it, kind of mash it together, see how the pieces fit. Some pieces of the puzzle won't fit. We're trying to, so we have to move them out and grab another piece of the puzzle. This is an exploration, in other words. This isn't a thesis trying to prove something or other, because really, truly, and especially with historical Jesus studies, you can't get to proof. Forget the idea of proving anything. That is to miss the whole point of the exercise. You don't get to prove it. We're discussing, analyzing, testing the probabilities. That's the best we can do, really seriously. So, and then Drum Dude comes along and he says, exactly. This is what we find in the different Gospels. Jesus's character is morphed differently in each of the Gospels according to the needs of the audience that the writer is writing for. And all you have to do sincerely is just read Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Take one a day and read through them. And this is so easy to see that this is fundamental. And also, the idea of objective history itself is a relatively modern invention, because there are plenty of people we are fairly sure existed back then with about as much documentation as we have of Jesus. And then you have the wealth of surviving manuscripts. So historians say there is nothing like that much evidence for anything else of that time period. The Gospels were incredibly important and became so incredibly quickly. That's why I think the burden of proof is on the mythicist position. And I would have a tendency to agree with Drum Dude on this one. That for me, that makes sense. And now here comes our good friend Manetho. Now, Manetho is another one of the Jesus scholars, I will call him. He's very well read. And him, along with Kishkumen, really put the clamps onto this mythic Jesus theme in very interesting ways. And that's what I wanted to just to share with you, to show the back and forth between scholars having a rip-roaring good time talking as friends instead of trying to convert each other and beat the snot out of each other and torture the other guy's children like happened in early Christianity. Hopefully we're a bit more mature than that now. So now, Drum Dude did say it would be helpful to know what the basic timeline of your mythic hypothesis is, Dastardly Stem. Who started it? Who created what and why? Things like that, right? So Manetho says this is the key thing here, the chronology, the timeline. Let's take a look at this. I can give you what I consider a probable reconstruction of how Christianity emerged, including a very rough timeline for the process, and especially the motivations of the people who formed it. I'm not writing it out now, though. I can if people are interested. He does this a little later on. We won't get to this tonight, but it's his overall philosophy here that I wanted to share. Although I'm not steeped in studies of the historical Jesus, I think my outline generally fits with what a lot of those scholars think. Your hypothesis looks pretty vague. Similarities are one thing, but you don't say much about who created the myth, why they created the myth, or when they created the myth. So again, through a discussion, we're going to begin to get a greater, broader clarification of all kinds of stuff about Jesus in the gospel and about the gospels, as far as that goes, which is very valuable. So my other objection is that comparisons to polytheistic beliefs are actually viable. As you say, Judaism was far from free of Hellenistic influence. See, Judaism wasn't living and getting through history in a vacuum any more than Joseph Smith ever was. And this is a really importantly critical point. But now that we know there are similarities, let's analyze this, because the similarities don't necessarily indicate that Jesus was purely mythical either. There are certainly myths about non-historical deities and culture heroes with elements similar to the Christian traditions about Jesus. You've got Osiris, Hercules, Romulus, and so on. All of those guys. But those deities and culture heroes were figures who were thought to have existed in the prehistoric or the proto-historic past, and the myths about them emerged long before the Hellenistic period, let alone that of the Roman Empire. But during the Hellenistic and Roman times, those same myth-like tropes were applied to historical people. Plato, Alexander, Augustus, and Apollonius of Tyana were all said to have been fathered by gods. Julius Caesar, Augustus, and Apollonius were said to have become divine or risen to heaven upon death. So the age-old mythic tropes were applied to real historical people to demonstrate that these people were divine. So Manetho's point here is also intriguing, because he's saying the mythological aspects that were applied to historical people didn't show that they didn't exist. Oh, they existed, but mythology was stacked on them. But that has nothing to do with whether they existed or not. Perhaps this same application of this cultural view, this cultural practice in Jesus's day could be applied to Jesus. In other words, just because there are mythical elements in the Gospels, and there are, does not mean that's evidence that Jesus did not exist. And I think that's a pretty good argument. That's not bad. That's good. I get that. That is really quite well said. So, and again, let me scroll down here. Let me read this. Okay, now, and this is a pretty important point in Stem's argument here. He's answering res ipsa. Stem, how do the parallels you cite support the conclusion that the mythical divine Christ, wholly invented as opposed to being a mythologized real person? And so here's what Stem says. It's a good question, but I find it a little bit odd considering all that we have. In this thread, I've limited Jesus's history stories to Paul and Mark. Those that come after Mark are quite positively dependent sources. So we have a Jesus in Paul, wherein Paul only very rarely and ambiguously gives hints that maybe Jesus lived before him. But I would question each one of those rare mentions, wondering if any of them are explicit enough to overcome the mythicist hypothesis or to really support the notion of historicity. But Mark's story now, Mark's gospel, clearly and without equivocation claims Jesus lived. So that's where we read of the claim. If we read with some degree of skepticism, as we should, as I see it, then how do we support Mark's claim? If Mark's own claim pretends to render many themes and stories from all previous myths that were well known among the Roman and Greek upbringing, then how do we even take seriously that his story is history? Or that his characters were real people? Did he mean it as such? Interestingly, there is a mystery element added to Mark. He mentions a couple of times that the story he's writing and the gospel he's publishing was not supposed to be told to anyone. And this is the messianic secret, the Mark 9:9 and 7:36 and so on and so forth, 16:8. So surely the mystery element all by itself doesn't do justice to the claim that there was no Jesus, but it's not like it's against such a notion. Additionally, it's apparent to some, and I find the arguments pretty persuasive, that Mark had reliance on at least some portion of Paul's letters. Additionally, as previous threads and discussions have demonstrated, it is quite likely that the anonymous Gospel of Mark, or the anonymous author of Mark, had a community among other Greek literal elites and was writing creatively to impress his community. So that'd be how he would have been able to get his writing circulated to any extent. He'd have to impress his immediate audience, that is, his community. All right. There's little reason to think he wrote his account on the back of oral stories passed around to his ears. That's guesswork. I mean, it could have happened, but it just seems less likely given things like Mark's stories all have familiarity in content and wording as many Greek and Roman myths that were commonly held. So the stories continue to be reminiscent of previous stories, and there's nothing to suggest the stories found in Mark are history. So on the whole, the idea that Mark rendered previous hero and God myths in order to bolster his own character doesn't necessarily suggest Jesus never lived. It simply becomes more likely considering all the other elements that we ought to consider. And then he goes on to the second aspect of res ipsa's question, where he had asked him, why do you expect that there would not be parallels to other mythical figures if the myth of the divine Christ were based on a real guy named Jesus? It's a great question. Well, it may or may not be expected. Alexander was mythologized and given divine status in such mythologies. There are similarities, I know, but there is also 1 ton of evidence demonstrating Alexander actually lived, which is clearly not the case for Jesus. On Jesus's case, it seems more reasonable to give an I don't know and leaving at some level of probability than to say he must have lived. So let's consider this scenario. Oh, yeah, I'll get to this. Sorry. I will get back to this when Kishkumen responds to him. Yeah, his whole basis. I want to skip that until I get to Kishkumen. So, and then Huckleberry added, you remember, to Recips's question, could the storytelling devices from Hellenistic tradition, imitation, shape how the gospel narratives were shaped and put together? Is that a clarifying aspect of the historical Jesus? And Stem says, so the question is not, can we prove there was no Jesus at all? We're talking history. And this leaves us in the realm of measuring probabilities. So if Mark's gospel is creative writing, utilizing ideas and themes taken from the well-known mythic culture, then it could be Jesus lived or not lived. Sure. But if there is none other material from Mark's day supporting the claim, then we have the question that we can't quite settle. It could be that Jesus lived, or it could be that Jesus never was, since the stories are simply mythology. And we have no other data confirming the claim made by Mark about Jesus's existence, is what he's saying. The practice has been due to the predominant religion of our day to just say, of course Jesus lived. But it's always interesting, as I see it, and useful to push against dogma like this. I would say there are tons of reasons to question the assumption of Jesus's historicity. So Dastardly Stem is giving us the one side, and there are several others, Honor and Theos, Manetho, and pretty soon Kishkumen here, who is giving us the other side. And this is where I'm starting to get into the good stuff. I really wanted to get to this part because this is the whole point of tonight's exercise as far as I'm concerned, and the reason why is because I too, when I read Richard Carrier, I was bowled over by him and I touted it on the internet a lot. I was very, very impressed. And he does have a wonderful analysis. But it's not as convincing to me now that I've read other histories, analysis of the historical Jesus, as it was when I read Carrier. It's very interesting that I had the interesting coincidence of, as I was definitely losing my faith, all of a sudden I found Richard Carrier. And that really helped get things going. But let's take a look here, because this is so interesting how this is one of those things I suspect we'll disagree about and move on. Thinking like a Bayesian, that is, using Bayesian probability, my question is, should the existence of these parallels with the Greek and Roman mythology to the Gospels in the New Testament? We know there are parallels. There's no question about that. Dennis R. MacDonald has demonstrated that. So has Richard Carrier and many other writers, the Millers. The question now, though, is, should the existence of these parallels affect our prior probability? So if you have to appeal to your prior probability to argue that the new evidence changes the prior probability, the answer is clearly no. The parallelism argument should be discarded as irrelevant. And I personally think he's pushing that without parallelism, you don't have historical analysis. There has to be some parallelism in all of historical studies. So I think he's pushing the envelope a little bit hard on that one. And now a gentleman named Pseudo Paul really takes Dastardly Stem to task. He said, "You've got it exactly backwards. The vast majority of New Testament scholars agree that there is a historical person behind the Jesus in the Gospels, although the self-identity and history of that person is very different from what the evangelists portray of our day, of course, yes. So mythicists are just on the fringe of academia, and they haven't made their case, according to Pseudo Paul." And then they're going through a lot. They're rechecking a lot of material, and they begin to say, "No, you're misunderstanding the situation. Scholars are not doing what you propose." And then they come back and say, "Well, scholars are not doing what you propose," and so on and so forth. So I think I read that, and this is Manetho. Now, someone compared Dennis R. MacDonald's use of parallels to the use of parallels that Hugh Nibley presented, say, with his Book of Mormon and his Book of Abraham studies, and Dastardly Stem took exception to that, and so do I. Definitely. I'm on Dastardly Stem's side here for this reason. I think he says it pretty good. Something I overlooked a bit but wanted to comment a little more on. Failed Prophet suggested MacDonald's work is comparable to Nibley, and Recipsa agreed. I'm surprised by this. I can't figure out how exactly there is much of a similarity. So here we get a real good contrast. Nibley points to vague allusions of roughly similar sounding ideas from peoples of ancient Israel, Mesopotamia, Egypt, etc., to demonstrate that the Book of Abraham or the Book of Mormon could possibly be said to be inspired. That is, Nibley wished to demonstrate modern books are from God because he can point to really tenuous sounding parallels from ancient times found in roughly the region and time Joseph Smith's works should be found. That's not at all similar to what Dennis MacDonald has been doing, and Stem is exactly correct. MacDonald has detailed many pieces of quoted material and similar stories with quoted terms and phrases from works that predominated educated Roman and Greek circles from which the New Testament writings emerged in the first century of the Common Era. And somehow, to these people, to suggest that MacDonald's work should be mocked as Nibley-esque, I don't agree with that. That's laughable. So, and I agree with Dastardly Stem on that. The two are not in the same arena of discourse at all. MacDonald is vastly superior to anything Nibley produced. But see, that again is my own subjective take on it, having read both extensively in Nibley and MacDonald. So that's just me. You guys have to find out for yourselves. So I think I read that MacDonald himself believes Jesus actually existed. M. David Litwa, another scholar who says studies of the gospel should engage more with Greek mythology, also believes Jesus actually existed. And I am here to tell you, M. David Litwa is a sensational Mediterranean cultures biblical scholar. He is incredibly enlightening and good. According to this response to one of his books, Litwa's contention that the Gospels are myths made to look historical is going to thrill the mythicists and it will be initially met with gasps of excitement and anticipation by the online Jesus mythicist community, and their gasps of joy will dissipate just as quickly once they realize that Litwa himself is not a Jesus mythicist, but he does believe in a historical Jesus. So it's entirely plausible that multiple mythic elements could be applied to a historical person, and that still seems to be what most scholars believe happened with Jesus. Now, again, what is the relevance of this to Mormonism? It is very, very critically important for this reason, because I'm going for centuries now. We've been doing this now for centuries as a scholars group, biblical scholarship. Archaeology plays a part in this as well, so there's linguistics, stuff like that. But as a general, overall, broad category, biblical scholarship for the last several centuries has indicated without question that certain types of literatures can be compared, analyzed, and we have learned astonishingly quite well how to distinguish mythic elements from historical elements in ancient texts. As a general rule, there's always going to be exceptions, of course. There's no question about that. We're not saying this is perfect, but it is powerful, and we have a decent control on it overarchingly for the most part. And many of the mythical elements that were invented has found their way into Joseph Smith's translated scriptures, and they shouldn't be there. So again, the relevance of this type of a study of how does mythology work with the historical Jesus? How does historicity work with the historical Jesus? How do the two interrelate together? And what relevance does it have to Mormonism is simply astonishing, because the claim is that the creator of the universe, the one who is supposed to see all things at any single moment so that he knows the truth of reality, can't seem to reveal actual historical reality to Joseph Smith of what happened in the ancient world, because there are known complete ridiculous mythological elements in his books that should not be there, especially in the book of Abraham. You know, that first chapter on the history of the founding of Egypt is total bunk. That's not history. It just, look, Egypt did not begin that way. That is just fundamental. Anybody with a smidgen of time can Google the history of Egypt and see that Joseph Smith's Book of Abraham is a concoction of bunk. It just doesn't work. So this becomes problematic in some aspects for Joseph Smith and some of his interpretations of the influence of Jesus in other cultures besides those found in the Bible. And so the relevance becomes very, very interesting that way. And so let me keep going. And Manetho. Okay, and this is so good. Now, Dastardly had said in one of the previous comments, I'll read it here now because Manetho's response is so good. So I'm suggesting Paul was the first one to write, and this is Dastardly Stems talking. So I'm suggesting Paul was the first one to write about Jesus. Mark was second in the historical record. They both were diaspora Jews steeped in Greek and Roman thought. There is no clear evidence that either of them got stories or material from anyone else regarding who Jesus was or what he should be. Indeed, the vague description by Paul is James and Peter believed in him previous to Paul, but when Paul met up with them, he found himself disappointed in what they had to offer. It may very well be that their Jesus was quite a bit different from his Jesus. The contention was, apparently, Paul wanted others to convert. Peter wanted to convert Jews, but we get no word from Peter or James, so we don't know what they thought. I would suggest there was a weak or raw version of Paul's later version floating among some illiterate people in Jerusalem and perhaps minimally in regions nearby, but what that was might not really have been quite as coherent as what Paul tried to preach, nor what Mark later wrote. So we're talking very sketchy history here, but that'd be part of the point. It's not neat and tidy. The guesswork can be near infinite if we let it. And Manetho then brings up a point. But why was Jesus invented in the first place? A very good question. Plato, Alexander, Julius Caesar, Augustus, and Apollonius of Tyana were all real people who had mythical tropes applied to them in historical times. It's a phenomenon that we know existed in this era of Jesus's day. We don't know of any analogous case of a mythical figure being relocated into recent history in the way you're proposing. If it happened, why did it happen? And I think that is a wonderful question. Very interesting comment there. And here is STEM's response to the question, why was Jesus invented in the first place? Why questions are perhaps the hardest to respond to. You make a point like, obviously, Jesus was put out to compete with the mythic beliefs prevalent among people surrounding diaspora Jews, but that'd be only part of it. Christians often argue Jesus needs to fulfill the messianic prophecies of Old Testament Jewish thought. Well, why and how? That's the thing. Who really knows? All talk of Jesus before Paul is lost. Whatever was invented before Paul might have been Pauline or might have been something quite different. Who really knows? And now to the point by Manetho that Plato, Alexander, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Apollonius of Tyana were all real people who had mythical tropes applied to them in historical times. And this is a cultural phenomenon of Jesus's day, we know, from other outside historical sources. His response is, your qualifier of recent may or may not apply all that much. Why would that matter? It could be that Jesus existed. It could be that he did not. That is the question. You seem to be suggesting it's evidence that he existed because Alexander existed, but it's two separate cases. Paul or Mark didn't write Alexander mythologies. They wrote mythologies about a Jewish hero god. Again, it's quite possible Jesus existed, taught things similar to what Paul or Mark thought he taught, started a religion, gained followers, and was killed. There just is no evidence for that. Do you think it's a good faith effort to show Jesus's historicity all because Alexander and others existed? There is evidence for these others that confirm their existence. That's why they are agreed to have existed. Here is Manetho's response to Stem's response. You seem to be missing my point, even though it's a point that Kishkumen and I have made before. In this era, we see multiple real people being elevated to divine status by having mythic elements applied to the stories of their actual lives. We do not see previously mythical figures being placed in a specific recent historical setting. And here's how Kishkumen put it. Never do we see someone who has made up a history out of seemingly authentic details to turn a god into a human being. We don't see it. Julius Dionysus, you may have seen him in such stories as the god who beheaded Pentheus, but now he's back, and he's a drunk consul of Rome defying Augustus's orders and getting into zany capers. So if you want to present the mythicist hypothesis as more probable than the historical one, or even equally probable as the historical one, you have to present a reason why the belief about Jesus developed differently from the way we would expect in this era. And I thought, wow, that is very interesting. Very good point. And now, Drum Dude asks Stem. I'm going to skip some of the discussion for the interest of time. I'm getting close to my time that I've got to quit here, so let's do a couple more. I will get more to Kishkumen's arguments in the next series, in the next video in this series. He is powerful. He is a historian of Roman history in Jesus's day, so he's a very good source. So Drum Dude asks Stem, if the Jews were to invent a character which was to be the Messiah, they would not have chosen the Jesus story. Jesus was not the new David they had expected. Jesus did not save the Jews from the Roman occupation. Jesus was not the glorious, triumphant leader they expected. He asked Jews to go against their traditions, to look inward instead of outward. Instead of being the Messiah they expected, Jesus was humiliated on the cross without accomplishing any of what the Messiah was supposed to do. You have to explain why they would create a story which was exactly opposite of the one they expected. What makes more sense is that a real leader named Jesus was martyred by the Romans, and they had to come up with a reason for why his failure was actually a victory. I thought, well, now that's an interesting way to put it, all right? Yeah. So, and now the statement here, and Drum Dude responds to this also. This statement is a very interesting part of this discussion. In Deconstructing Jesus, Robert M. Price claims that the Jesus of the New Testament is a composite figure. That is, he is put together out of which a broad variety of historical Jesuses can be reconstructed, any one of which may have been the real Jesus, but not all of them together. So according to Price, various Jesus images flowed together at the origin of Christianity, some of them possibly based on myth, some of them possibly based on a historical Jesus the Nazarene, and that the historical Jesus had become obscured behind the dogma. Price concluded that it is plausible that there might have been a historical Jesus whose story was completely assimilated into the mythic hero archetype, but that it was no longer possible to be sure there had ever been a real person underneath all the fiction. And here's what Drum Dude says. I think this is worth emphasizing. No one except believing Christians are claiming with the surety that the historical Jesus existed. all scholars are saying is that it seems very plausible that a historical Jesus existed, in as far as it is possible to know that anyone from that long ago existed, actually. So Bart Ehrman is certainly not providing any cover or support for believing Christians, because he doesn't believe the historical Jesus was anything but an apocalyptic Jewish preacher. He agrees with the myth position that supernatural aspects were slowly added onto the Jesus character over time. And it's some of these supernatural aspects of Jesus that made their way into some of Joseph Smith's own translated scriptures that caused so many problems for Mormonism and Joseph Smith's authenticity, right? So the fanatical position here is the belief that a historical Jesus could not possibly have existed. See, agnosticism about the historicity is perfectly warranted, and I don't see any scholars saying dogmatically Jesus 100% existed without zero doubt. And so this is a very important point as well. Let me take another look here. And of course, STEM is disputing that. And in fact, when he says you have to explain why they would create a story which was the exact opposite of the one that they expected, STEM does say Mark's story was created by, as Robin Faith Walsh puts it, an anonymous Hellenized Jew who was likely a part of a literal elite community set on impressing his community. So if Mark was to write a story that was to impress his fellow literate people, he had to hit the themes they thought were necessary for a godlike hero. And he did. So that seems pretty obvious, particularly for those who have dug deep into the works of Dennis R. MacDonald. I'm not impressed by the old theories because they are simply dogma at this point and carry little or no reasoning with little or no evidence to support them. And I honestly thought, perhaps I mislooked. I honestly thought Kish Kuman had started jumping in at this point, and he does jump in. I'm going to zippity doo-dah down here real quick. All of it's a wonderful discussion. Okay, so Dastardly Stem said later, it's less biased, it seems to me, than to take a bunch of characters and suggesting Jesus is like these all because timing. Manetho says, the deities and mythic heroes originated at some point in the prehistory or proto-history of Greece and Rome, when those cultures were not even fully literate yet. So the Hellenistic period and the early Roman Empire had highly literate upper classes of people. They had a long tradition of writing history and biography, and are probably the best documented periods in all of ancient history. They are fundamentally different eras. So historians of the ancient world have to understand how ancient cultures understood the world, how they remembered their own past, and how they viewed particular concepts relevant to the topic at hand, in this case, divinity. So in a pre-literate society, those things will be profoundly different from a culture with well-established literacy and a very busy scribal tradition. And this will be different again from an Enlightenment era society with printing presses and widespread literacy, which will be different again from a society with ubiquitous audio and video recording technology. So if you can't take those massive cultural differences into account when trying to assess historical plausibility, then why even bother? And I thought, well, that's pretty good. And that's so good though, and it's so long. Oh, I'm sorry. I've run out of time, you guys. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. What I'm going to do is I am on page 6. I'm going to write this down because I want to continue in this vein on this subject. Page 6 of this topic, because this is so well thought out. I didn't expect to stop in the middle of this. Sorry. An unrelenting case for history. An unrelenting case for history. What I think I'm getting from all of this is it can be an exciting issue. There is no reason to go to war over it. We don't have to begin hating each other because we have different interpretations. It's not all of a sudden that someone is Satan inspired and wicked and evil and un-American, kick him out of the country. There's no reason to have that kind of an approach with this study. And this is the one study that will cause those feelings. I mean, let's face it, it's quite an emotional issue. It's quite an issue that people really have their hearts and souls into, and that is a good thing. But now we want heart, soul, and mind, exploring the data and the evidence as best that we know how. So, hey, Rebecca Biblioteca, good to see you, dear. We will be on next week with Colby Reddish, Rebecca and I, right here on the Backyard Professor next Sunday. We will be talking about the tithing issues and problems with Mormonism. And then the week after that, Mormonish, Rebecca Biblioteca, and Landon Brophy, the man, and myself will be presenting the church essay on the Joseph Smith's first vision. And you're not going to want to miss that, because that issue is one of the problematic areas in Joseph Smith's story that I think demonstrates the non-historicity of the first vision. It's very interesting how historicity can play into this when we have more than one source that is contradictory. And so we will be exploring that issue as well. So the next 2 Sundays are promising to be grand slam homers with some excellent guests and some spectacular analysis and scholarship into issues that matter to all of us. So I want to thank all of you for coming over. I want to thank all of you for being here and all of your good support. I love all you guys. Be good to all, have fun, make lots of friends, smile. It makes people wonder what you're up to, and recognize above all else that here at the Backyard Professor, what we want most of all is clarity. I don't think that that's asking for too much from Mormonism, but that's exactly what they hide the most. And we are the antidote to their obscurity.